Imagine a superpower that controlled nearly half of Europe, rivaled the United States, and possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over, collapsing without a single invading army. In 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared almost overnight. No world war, no final battle, just the sudden end of one of the most powerful empires in history. How did this happen? The collapse of the Soviet Union was not caused by one leader, one mistake, or one event. It was the result of decades of economic weakness, political rigidity, social pressure, and a system that could no longer adapt to the modern world. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we must first understand what it was built on. The Soviet Union was founded in 1922 after the Russian Revolution and a brutal civil war. It was created as a communist state based on the idea that the government should control the economy, eliminate private ownership of major industries, and create equality through centralized planning. In theory, this system would eliminate exploitation and class divisions. In practice, it concentrated enormous power in the hands of the state. For decades, the Soviet system relied on strict control. The government decided what was produced, how much was produced, and where it was distributed. Political opposition was suppressed, media was censored, and loyalty to the Communist Party was enforced. This structure allowed the Soviet Union to industrialize rapidly and survive major crises, including World War II. After the war, the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower. It controlled Eastern Europe, competed with the United States for global influence, and led the communist world. For a time, the system appeared strong. But beneath the surface, serious problems were growing. One of the biggest weaknesses of the Soviet Union was its economy. Central planning allowed the state to focus on heavy industry and military production, but it struggled to provide consumer goods and innovation. Factories were rewarded for meeting quotas, not for efficiency or quality. This led to waste, shortages, and low productivity. Everyday life for ordinary citizens reflected these problems. Long lines for basic goods were common. Stores often lacked simple items. Housing shortages persisted for decades. While the Soviet Union could build tanks, rockets, and nuclear weapons, it struggled to meet the daily needs of its population. Over time, the gap between the Soviet Union and the West became impossible to ignore. Western countries experienced rising living standards, technological innovation, and consumer abundance. Soviet citizens, despite propaganda, could see the contrast through foreign broadcasts, travelers, and later television. The system also discouraged initiative. Since the state controlled wages, promotions, and resources, there was little incentive to innovate or improve efficiency. Corruption became widespread as people relied on informal networks to obtain scarce goods. Another major strain was military spending. The Cold War forced the Soviet Union into an arms race with the United States. Maintaining a massive military, supporting allies around the world, and competing in space drained enormous resources. A large portion of the Soviet economy was devoted to defense, leaving less for civilian development. At the same time, the Soviet Union was responsible for controlling Eastern Europe. Military interventions in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia showed how costly this control could be. Keeping communist governments in power required constant pressure and resources. By the 1970s and 1980s, economic growth slowed dramatically. The system that once delivered rapid industrial progress had become rigid and outdated. Problems were hidden rather than solved, because admitting failure could threaten political careers. Political stagnation made the situation worse. Leadership in the Soviet Union was dominated by aging officials resistant to change. Decision-making became slow, cautious, and disconnected from reality. Reform was risky, and maintaining control became the priority. Meanwhile, society was changing. Education levels rose. People became more aware of global standards of living. Younger generations were less willing to accept shortages, censorship, and lack of freedom as normal. The gap between official propaganda and daily reality widened. Ethnic and national tensions also played a role. The Soviet Union was not a single nation, but a union of many republics with different languages, cultures, and histories. While the state promoted unity, resentment simmered beneath the surface. Many groups felt dominated by Moscow and sought greater autonomy. The turning point came in the 1980s with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev. When Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union, he inherited a system in deep trouble. Unlike his predecessors, he believed that reform was necessary for survival. He introduced two major policies: restructuring and openness. Economic reforms aimed to reduce state control and improve efficiency. Social reforms reduced censorship and allowed greater freedom of expression. For the first time, people could openly criticize the government, discuss past mistakes, and debate the future. Gorbachev also changed Soviet foreign policy. He reduced military tensions with the West, withdrew troops from Afghanistan, and signaled that the Soviet Union would no longer use force to control Eastern Europe. These decisions had enormous consequences. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments lost Soviet backing. Without the threat of military intervention, protest movements gained strength. One by one, communist regimes collapsed. The fall of the Berlin Wall became the most visible symbol of this transformation. Inside the Soviet Union, openness unleashed forces the government could not control. Long-suppressed grievances came to the surface. Nationalist movements grew stronger in several republics. Demands for independence replaced calls for reform. At the same time, economic reforms failed to deliver quick improvements. Instead, they disrupted existing systems without fully replacing them. Shortages worsened. Inflation increased. Public frustration grew. The Communist Party began to lose authority. Power shifted away from centralized control toward local governments and republics. The idea of the Soviet Union as a unified state weakened rapidly. In 1991, hardline officials attempted a coup to stop the reforms and preserve the old system. The coup failed, but it fatally weakened the central government. After this moment, the collapse became unavoidable. Republic after republic declared independence. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union. The state that had existed for nearly 70 years officially ceased to exist. The collapse shocked the world. A superpower had fallen not through invasion, but through internal collapse. The consequences were enormous. New nations emerged across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Borders were redrawn. Economies struggled through painful transitions. Millions of people faced uncertainty, poverty, and identity crises. Russia inherited much of the Soviet Union's military power, including nuclear weapons, but lost its empire and global influence. The Cold War was over, but new tensions and challenges emerged in its place. The collapse of the Soviet Union showed the limits of centralized control in a rapidly changing world. It demonstrated that military strength cannot compensate for economic weakness, political stagnation, and lack of legitimacy. Most importantly, it showed that systems built on fear and control can appear stable for decades, until they suddenly are not. Understanding why the Soviet Union collapsed helps explain the end of the Cold War, the political landscape of modern Europe and Asia, and many global tensions that still exist today. It was not the fall of a single government, but the collapse of an entire way of organizing society. And it serves as a reminder that even the most powerful empires can fall when they fail to adapt.